Today, we're going to unpack one of the most sudden and, frankly, shocking ecological disasters of our time. It's really a detective story, one that starts with silent skies over South Asia and ends up uncovering a killer that was hiding in plain sight the entire time. All right, let's get into it.
Just try to imagine this. You look up at a sky that was always full of birds, and now it's empty. That is exactly what happened in India, Pakistan, and Nepal. In just a couple of decades, 99.5% of the region's most important vultures just vanished. This wasn't some slow, gradual decline. It was an absolute free fall.
And this, of course, raises the critical question that everybody, from scientists to public health officials, was suddenly forced to ask. Vultures, they're the ultimate scavengers. They are nature's cleanup crew. So what happens to an entire ecosystem and to us when they're suddenly gone? Well, the answer turned out to be absolutely terrifying.
So, to really get a handle on the sheer scale of what was lost, we've got to rewind the clock a bit. Because before the skies went silent, these birds were one of the most common raptors on the entire planet. Let's set the scene for this incredible ecological mystery.
You know, the most staggering part of this whole story is just the speed of the collapse. In the early 1980s, you had something like 40 million of these vultures soaring around. They were just a normal part of the landscape. But by 2017, that number had crashed to just 19,000. That's not just a decline, it's a population wipeout with almost no parallel in the history of conservation.
So, why does this matter so much? Well, vultures are what we call a keystone species. In a place like India, where cows are sacred and their carcasses are often left out in the open, vultures were the disposal system. They cleaned up everything, preventing the spread of all kinds of nasty diseases. And beyond that, they were central to the ancient sky burial traditions of the Parsi community. They were truly deeply woven into the fabric of life.
Okay, so you have millions of birds literally falling out of the sky. The race was on to find the killer. Scientists from all over the world jumped into this investigation, trying desperately to figure out what on earth could wipe out an entire family of birds this fast.
This timeline really shows you how this thing started as a whisper and then became a roar. It began in the early 90s with a few scientists raising an alarm in one park. But by the mid-90s, everyday people, villagers, Parsi communities, they were all noticing the same thing. The skies were empty. Fast forward to 2002, and it's a global story, a full-blown catastrophe. But the scientists were still stumped. The pressure to find an answer was just immense.
So naturally, investigators went after all the usual culprits. Could it be pesticide poisoning, like the old stories about DDT? Nope. Tests came back negative. What about industrial pollution? Again, they found nothing unusual in the vulture's tissues. Okay, so maybe it's a new, super contagious bird flu or virus. Researchers looked and came up completely empty. Every single lead was a dead end, which just made the whole thing even scarier.
And then, in 2003, the breakthrough. The killer wasn't some new super virus or a deliberate poison. It was something way more common. Something being used every single day across the entire subcontinent, with absolutely no one having any idea of its devastating secret.
The culprit was a drug called diclofenac. The easiest way to think about it is like it's ibuprofen for cows. It was a cheap, super effective painkiller given to sick and injured livestock. It was seen as this helpful, everyday veterinary medicine. But for vultures, it was a deadly poison.
And here's the deadly chain reaction. It's tragically simple. A farmer gives his cow diclofenac to help with some pain. The cow eventually dies, and its carcass is left out, as is the custom. A flock of vultures swoops in to do its ecological job, but by eating that contaminated meat, they get a fatal dose. The drug literally causes their kidneys to fail, and it kills them within just a few days.
And this is the part that is just so hard to wrap your head around, how incredibly sensitive the vultures were to this stuff. This quote from the research is mind-blowing. It says that if just 1 out of every 100 carcasses contained diclofenac, it was enough to cause the population to crash by up to 90% every single year. And in reality, studies found about 10% of carcasses were contaminated. The vultures never stood a chance.
But believe it or not, the story doesn't end with the death of the vultures. Their disappearance created this massive vacuum in the ecosystem. And what rushed in to fill that void? Well, it triggered a massive public health crisis for humans.
So, without vultures, you suddenly have millions of tons of rotting meat just lying around. This created an all-you-can-eat buffet for other scavengers, and one group in particular exploded: feral dogs. Their population shot up by an estimated 5 million. And what happens when you have 5 million more feral dogs roaming around? You get a terrifying increase in dog bites. We're talking more than 38 million additional bites being reported, totally overwhelming public health systems.
And this, right here, is the most devastating consequence of all. Rabies, a disease usually transmitted by dogs, was already a big problem. But this explosion in the dog population led directly to an estimated 47,000 extra human deaths. Just think about that for a second. There is a direct, tragic, and undeniable line from a simple veterinary drug to a deadly human epidemic.
And when you add everything up, the healthcare costs from rabies, the lost productivity, the cost of trying to replace the Vultures' free cleanup service, the total economic damage is estimated to be a staggering $34 billion. It's just a powerful reminder that the work nature does for free has immense economic value.
And beyond all the big numbers, there was this profound cultural cost. For India's Parsi community, the loss of the vultures meant the end of a sacred tradition that was centuries old. Without the birds to consume the bodies, their towers of silence became unhygienic, forcing the community to abandon a practice that was absolutely central to their faith. So, with the killer identified and the devastating consequences laid bare, the focus shifted to this desperate race against time. Could the vultures actually be saved from complete extinction?
Well, the good news is the solution seemed pretty straightforward. In 2006, India and its neighbors banned the use of diclofenac in animals. And, crucially, scientists had already found a safe alternative, another anti-inflammatory drug called meloxicam. It does the exact same job for livestock, but it's completely harmless to vultures.
Now, the road to recovery is a long one. It starts with actually enforcing the ban, which is still a challenge, and getting everyone to use the safe alternatives. But a huge piece of the puzzle is these captive breeding programs. People call them vulture restaurants, where they can build up a healthy population in a totally safe environment, with the ultimate goal of one day releasing them back into a clean, safe wild.
But even with a solid plan, recovery is never simple. This chart kind of highlights one of the big complications. Research shows that even when you provide safe food, there's now this intense competition at the carcasses. Larger and more aggressive vulture species tend to dominate and push out the smaller ones, which makes it a lot harder for those more vulnerable populations to rebound. The whole ecosystem is still just out of balance.
And really, this brings us to the final thought. The Indian vulture crisis is just this stark, brutal lesson in unintended consequences. A single, common, seemingly harmless drug created a domino effect that wiped out wildlife, sparked a public health emergency, and cost billions of dollars. And it just forces you to ask the question, what other fragile, invisible connections are holding our world together, and what might happen if we unknowingly break them?